Hey everyone, it's Anthony from Pretty Printed here. In today's video, I'm going to continue where I left off in the last video on building this weather app in Express. So in the last video, I got this far where I can see the weather for one city, in this particular case, Las Vegas. And what I want to do in this video is set it up to where I can see the weather for multiple cities, and those cities will come from my database. So I'll use a MongoDB database for this, and I'll be using the MLab service to create that database. And I'll be pulling from that database in my app and then getting the weather for each one of those locations. So if you see my video with this in either Flask or Django, you'll notice that in those two frameworks, it's a lot easier to do what I'm about to do. But when using Node and Express, it becomes a little more difficult because of the asynchronous nature of Node. So the requests are the problematic part. I can't just run the requests synchronously. I have to kind of use them in an asynchronous way. And that's basically what I'll be doing in this video. So I'm not going to cover the form where I add new things into the database because I don't want this video to get too long. So in the next video, which will be the final part, I'll cover adding the text for the input for the form here. So to get started with this, the first thing I want to do is I want to set up a database. So I'll go to MLab for that and I'll create a new database. And I'm just going to quickly go through the steps here. We're going to create a free database. And then I'll put East. I'll give it a name. So let's say Express Weather. And then that should be it for creating the database. Okay, so I have the database created and it's done generating now. I need to add a user. So to do that, the username is going to be, let's just say Pretty Printed, and the password is going to be password 11, the same password I use for everything. Everything in these tutorials, at least. And if I can type correctly, then the passwords will match. Okay, so I'll create this new user. And that should be enough for me to use the database. So I have this database URI here. And the next thing I need to do is I need to actually install the tool that's going to allow me to interface with the database. And that's going to be Mongoose. So I'm going to npm install Mongoose. And then I'll go to my code and I'll require it. So var mongoose equals require mongoose, just like that. And let's see, it's not done installing, but I can go ahead and start with the rest of the part. So after this app set view engine, I'm going to connect to my database. So to do that, I just use Mongoose and then I use the connect method, and I need to supply the URI that they have here. So I'll just copy this and I'll paste it into my code. And I need to update the username and password. So the user I created is Pretty Printed, and the password is going to be password 11, just like that. So you can see it in plain text. This is just a temporary database, so I don't care if you see the password. And then after that, so let's see if it's still installing. It's done installing. So after that, what I want to do is I want to actually set up a schema for this database. So I'll bring in the schema from Mongoose. And, actually, I won't bring it in. I'll just create it directly. So I'm going to call this the city schema. So city schema is going to represent cities, obviously. So city schema is going to be equal to new and then mongoose.schema. And then this is going to allow me to create a representation of what I want the documents in my database to look like. In my case, I only need one thing, and I need the name of the city. So it's going to be a string. And that's it. So that's all I'm defining for my schema. If I had more information for each city, then I can put it in here. But in my particular case, I only care about the name of the city because that's what I'm using the app for. It doesn't do anything else with the information from a particular city. So now I'll create a city model using the schema. So I'll call this city model. And then it's going to be mongoose.model. And then I need to pass in, I need to pass in the schema, and I also need to pass in, I believe, a name. So the name will be city, and the schema gets passed in as well. So now with the city model, I'm able to actually create new cities. So using the city model is what allows me to actually interface with the database and like add new cities and query the database as well. So now what I want to do is I want to actually add some cities into the database. And let's see, what would be easier? Add collection. No, so yeah, this is going to create a city collection for me in the code. So since I don't have any convenient place to put in the first few values, I'll just put it here and then I'll comment out the code. So I'll leave that here if you want to insert the same cities into your database. But for my purposes, I'm just going to put it here and then comment it out. You'll see what I mean once I do it. So I'm going to create 3 new cities. So one city is going to be Las Vegas. So new city model. And then I pass in the information that matches the schema. So I need to pass in a name. And then the name of the city will be Las Vegas. And then I need to do that a couple of more times for 2 other cities that I want to add. So I'll add Toronto as a city. Toronto. And then I'll add Sydney as a city as well. So Sydney, just like that. And I deleted the quote. Okay, and then once I have those 3, I can save them. So Las Vegas.save, Toronto.save, and then Sydney.save. And now I'll start up my app. And then I'll stop my app. So the reason why I did it that way is because when you start up the app, so you start up server.js, it's going to run everything in here. So it's going to get to the code here and run it and then save it. I don't want this to run every single time I run the app because it's only useful once. I'm just seeding the database so we have some initial information to work with. Whoops. So I'll just comment this out and I'll leave it in the code in case anybody wants to run this themselves, but I just want to run it once. And to verify that the data was actually saved to the database, I'll refresh. I see there's a new collection, cities. And then if I look here, I see Las Vegas and I only see Las Vegas. So let me see if I need to run it individually for each city. So I'll uncomment Sydney first, save it, and then I'll start the server. And then let's see if I can see Sydney here. I do. So I'll do the same thing for Toronto. So uncomment Toronto, and then run it. And that should have created Toronto. NodeMon is restarting my server automatically. Okay, so Toronto is now there. And if I comment out Toronto, I should be good. So now I have all the information in the database that I want to work with initially. So Sydney, Las Vegas, and Toronto. So those are going to be the 3 cities that I'm going to get the weather for. And we're going to see them here in this list. So in addition to Las Vegas, we'll see Toronto and Sydney. And of course, Las Vegas will pull from the database instead of pulling from the hard-coded value that I have here, Las Vegas. You know what? I'll just comment that out since I won't need it anymore. Okay, so now what I want to do, and I'll stop the app because now it's going to crash without the city variable. Now what I want to do is I want to handle the case where I'm actually sending the requests to the Open Weather Map API. So it was pretty straightforward before when I was only sending one request because I would send the request and whenever the request was done in the callback function, I would just parse the JSON result and then create a weather object and pass that to the template. But because I'm using multiple requests, I can't do it as simply as that anymore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a different library for requests. Instead of requests, I'm going to use request promise. And it's going to work pretty similar to requests, but instead of requests using a callback function is going to return a promise. And you'll see how I'll use that in a second. So npm install request promise. And then I'll just change this to request promise. And I'll keep the name of the variable request. And hopefully this doesn't take too long to install. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function that will take in a list of cities. So this list of cities is going to come from the database, but this function that I'm going to create is just going to be a function that takes in a list, or an array, I should say. I'm not using Python. It's going to take in an array of cities, and using that is going to get the weather data for each city using request promise. So this is going to be an async function. And the way I like to think about async functions is writing them in the synchronous way first and then adding the async and the await later, because I guess the appeal of async and await is that it's not synchronous, but it looks like it's synchronous. Like the way you write the code is synchronous, but it doesn't behave in a synchronous way. So I'll explain more about this as I write it. But I'll create a new function and I'll call this function get weather. And it's going to take in a list of cities. So function get weather is going to take in a list of cities just like that, or an array of cities. And what I want to do is I want to first loop over the list of cities. So to do that, I'm going to have a for loop. Let's do for of. And I know I'm mixing different versions of JavaScript here, but I already started with an old version and now I want to use something with a new version. So I hope you don't get too confused about that, but I'm just using features from different versions of JavaScript, but it all works the same. So I'm going to use a for of loop. So let's say for, city of cities. So this is my loop. So it's just looking at each individual city that I pass into this array here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in my URL. So I'll move this URL. Where's my URL? I'll move it inside of this function here because it still has this placeholder, and this placeholder needs to be set every time this URL is called. So I need to put it up here. And what I want to do next is I want to actually send a request to the URL. So if I can just get to the next line so I can write requests, it's going to be requests and then the URL. So because I'm not using a callback, this is going to return a promise. So the original request I was using uses callbacks. This one uses promises. So I'll just call this body, meaning let's say response body. So the response data that comes back from the request. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to parse that out because it's JSON. So I'll call this weather JSON. And it's going to be JSON.parse response body, just like that. And now that I have that, I can now go inside the weather JSON and build my weather object. So it's going to be pretty similar to this one down here. So what I'll do is I'll move this up and everything should be the same. So the weather JSON is still the same. So what it's doing is it's taking the city from the list, and then it's taking the weather, so the temperature, the description, and the icon for that particular city. And then because I have multiple cities, so there are going to be multiple requests, I'm going to append this to some array that's going to hold all of the weather data. So it's going to hold all the objects for all the cities that I have in the database. So I'll call this weather data, and it's going to be an array. And I'll simply push this into this weather data. So weather data push weather. Okay, just like that. And then outside the for loop, what I want this function to do is return that weather data. So just looking at it here, basically what this function does is it's going to get the weather for an array of cities. It's going to perform a request to each for each city, and it's going to add the weather information to an object and push that object onto this weather data array and then return that array here. So if you are really familiar with Node, you know this won't work as it is right now because it's performing this asynchronous request, and inside of my app.get, it's also going to be asynchronous. So I can't just throw this in there and expect it to work. So what I need to do is I need to use async and await. So to use await inside of a function, I need to make it async, just like that. And then the await part needs to be the part that is asynchronous. So await here. So basically what this is doing is this function is going to wait for the request to finish, and then it will continue. So instead of skipping over this line when the request is sent off somewhere else, it's going to wait for the request to finish, and then it's going to continue with the code, and it's going to do that for each city in the database. This could be done in parallel for each city, but Since this app is simple, I'm just going to do them sequentially. So basically, it's going to perform one request at a time. You could set it up using something like promise.all to perform all the requests at the same time, but I don't want to add that just because this app is simple. But if that's something that you want to do when you're extending this, then go ahead. It's a great learning exercise. So basically, with this await, I can now use this asynchronous call inside of this function, and the code is still written in like a synchronous way. So you don't see any callbacks here, but it's still asynchronous because I have the async here and the await. So now that I have that, I can actually use it inside of my app.get. So what I want to do is first I'll remove the request because I don't need that anymore. I'll remove the parts that I don't need. So basically all that there. So what I want to do first is I want to actually get the list of cities from the database. So to start, I'm going to run city model and then .find. And I'm not looking for anything in particular, so I'm going to pass an empty object. I want everything returned. And this is going to have a callback function. And the callback function is going to take in an error and then the actual results. So in this case, I'll call the results cities. Just like that. And what I'll do is I'll console log cities so we can see if our cities are returned from the database. So remember that we have Toronto, Sydney, and Las Vegas. So if I start up my app, hopefully it works. And then if I go here, it's not going to return the page because I took that part out temporarily, but I do see the information that I want here. So I see the 3 cities that I have. And of course that has the ID that is embedded in the document for each city. But the important part is I see the name and then the name of the city here. So what I want to do now is I want to pass this information to that function. And what I'll do, since this is a list of objects or an array of objects, I'm going to actually look in those objects inside of the get weather function. So this could be more generic, but what I'll do is, let's see, city object, and then I'll assign the city variable to be city object dot name. So instead of looking at a direct value, I'm looking at an object, and inside of that object, I'm getting the name. So that's getting me the name of the city. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take those cities, and I'm going to call get weather using the cities. So I'll get rid of this console.log. So calling get weather cities will perform these requests, and at the end is going to return the list of weather data. But I can't just use this as a regular function because it's an async function. So you can think of async functions as always returning promises. So I need to use the typical promise then, and I'll call this results. So basically what happens is whenever get weather cities is done, however long it takes, once it's done, it's going to call this callback function, and it's going to put the weather data in this results argument here. So with that, now I can start thinking about, passing the weather data to the template. But first, I'll just console log this to make sure it works. So console.log and then results. That way we can see if the weather data is getting built correctly. So I'll restart the server and then go here again. Still errors out because of the part that follows. But now we see here, I have the information for the 3 cities. So I see Las Vegas, I see Sydney, and I see Toronto. I see the appropriate descriptions and the icons and the temperature. So everything looks good there. So now I can go ahead and actually pass that to the template and then loop over that information and display it on the template, and then we'll be done for this video. So it's almost there. Okay, so here it's expecting some weather data, but I don't have that. So let me remove this. And what I wanted to do is first, this res render needs to go inside of this then function because I can't render the page until I've gotten the weather for all the cities. So it needs to go inside of here. And what I want to do is, let's see, I'm passing the weather data to the template. So I'll just leave weather data as the variable, but instead of using this var weather data down here, I'll create a new one. So I'll get rid of the console log results. And what I'm going to do is create a variable called weather data again. So weather data. And I'm going to pass the weather data to the template. So before I was just passing one object to the template, but now I want to pass an array. So to do that, I'll just pass the results that I have here to the template. So I'll call the results weather data inside the template. Results just like that. So now I'm passing those results to the template so they can be used. So if I get rid of this and comment out everything, this part should work, and I should get an error for the template failing. So let's see if that happens. Yep, I have a template error now. And that's because my data in the template is no longer of the same form. So what I need to do now is I need to go to the template, and I'm going to loop over that weather data. So let's see what I need to loop over. Here's where I have the weather information, and I already have the weather variable in a sense. So I'll just keep that. And I need to find where this repeats. So basically what I want to happen is I want that box that has the weather in it to repeat. So I'm going to put a for loop outside of the box. So there's the beginning of the box. And then I believe this is the end of the box. Yeah. So using EJS syntax, it just allows me to write JavaScript inside of the template. So it's going to be the bracket and then %. And then I'm going to do a for of loop. So let's just say for weather of weather data. So weather data is what I'm passing in. Remember, I renamed it to weather data from results, but it's just passing in the results. And then I'll put the opening bracket, and then I'll use the EJS syntax to close out this part because now it's going to HTML. And what I'll do is I'll close this off at the bottom, close off the for loop. So the bracket %, and then the close bracket for the for loop, and then close out the other for loop here, or close out the actual tag here. Okay, so that should be it. So now I'm getting this weather object from weather data, and it's a list of weather objects. And for each weather object, it's going to fill in the information here and render all of this HTML. So let's see if that works. And it does. So now I can see the weather for Las Vegas, for Sydney, and Toronto. And as you can see, it's pretty straightforward once you get the asynchronous part down. That was the most difficult part about this, even though it's not really that difficult because you can still write the function like it wasn't asynchronous, but you just add the async in the await inside the function whenever you're done. I think it's a little bit easier to write that way, but there may be cases where it just doesn't work out that well. But beyond that, everything else was fairly straightforward. So that's all I want to cover in this video. In part 3, the last video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the code to enable this form, because right now this doesn't do anything. It tells me cannot post / because I haven't set up anything to handle the form. And basically what's going to happen is I'm going to type in a city name. So let's say Los Angeles. I'll hit add city, and then Los Angeles would get added to my database. And then I would be able to see it here in the list of cities that I have, and I'd be able to get the weather for LA. So that's it for this video. If you have any questions about this video, feel free to leave a comment down below. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel already, please subscribe. So thank you for watching this video, and I will talk to you next time.